Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we speak openly about what it really takes to connect people at work. From internal comms and knowledge sharing to the messiness of change and the rise of AI, we go beyond best practices to unpack what's working, what's not, and what's worth rethinking. Our host, Bourgeault-Trickey, has spent over 10 years in internal comms, building and launching intranets for organizations in telecoms and finance. He now leads client services at Happeo, where he's helped over 120 businesses across the globe create and grow engaging digital workplaces that drive organizational goals and objectives. If you care about how people in your organization share, learn, and adapt, this is your show. And if you're looking for a modern digital HQ, you can find us at happeo.com.
Welcome to Happeo Unmuted, the podcast where we explore the messy, brilliant, and occasionally unfiltered world of internal comms, knowledge sharing, and digital transformation. I'm your host and Happeo's Principal of Client Services, Bourgeault-Trickey. Today's guest is Janna Stam, Manager of Executive and Enterprise Communications at CGI, where she supports senior global leaders and helps guide communication across a company of more than 90,000 professionals. She has nearly 20 years of experience in executive and internal communications in the tech and consulting sectors, including roles at TELUS and Deloitte. She has shaped messaging for digital transformations, mergers and acquisitions, and large-scale internal campaigns, and is known for turning complex ideas into clear communications people can act on. Thanks for joining us, Janna.
It's great to be here, Jesse. Thank you.
You bet. So I just want to kick off with our unmuted moments. So the first one we'll go with is, what's the moment in your job that makes all the chaos worth it?
Absolutely. I would say that I know everything is working when I see engagement patterns and qualitative signals line up. So sometimes that looks like great analytics or metrics, but I'm not going to lie. I think a personal note from a senior leader really brings everything home to me when I see that a post or a message made an emotional impact on someone. And I see that it got through to somebody in a way that's meaningful. That makes everything else feel like it falls into place. And I love it.
Do you keep like a kudos folder or anything like that for yourself?
Oh, you know the pattern too well. Yes, I have a feedback folder, which is just interesting feedback, but also positive comments and important experiences to remember, because as you can imagine, we get caught up in the day to day and we can forget about those fundamental moments of clarity or meaning for projects that might have taken months. And maybe it's only a 10 word email, but that can still make such a difference.
Yeah. No, it's funny. We've had one on my side too, and everybody seemingly has one. It's funny that we keep these things private, but in reality, it's an important kind of recognition within the org for these kinds of disciplines, right? I'm curious if, like, from the measurement standpoint, everybody seems to measure a little bit differently. I don't know if that's something you want to go into, but I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about like what your practices might look like over at your organization.
Definitely. I think internal comms is a little bit of a black box when it comes to measurement because there isn't as consistent of a practice or publicly shared standard, right? So, it's not like external marketing necessarily or external communications, which people might be a little more transparent about. So, what I've noticed over my time in communications is a lot of standards are set by norms that just happen to form over many years. So, if you're using, for example, um, we have a tool that we use to send emails out. You're going to start finding, what is the normal open rate, the click through rate, the share rate, and then over time you can say, well, it went up by 2%, therefore that's a good sign that it's improving. I think what we've learned, and sometimes it's hard to admit, is it's not always dramatic. The dramatic numbers that we dream of aren't always going to come to fruition. So sometimes, yes, indeed, 2 or 5% improvement is material, and it's important to celebrate that. We always aim for higher. I think we all want to see 100%, but sometimes we have to acknowledge technical limitations too. Like maybe that person saw the email as a subject line, and that was all they needed to know. They didn't need to go into the details of opening a message and scrolling through it when it comes to something like email. But it's also been really interesting to see other tools take off, like Viva Engage, which I know a lot of companies like to use. That has definitely been more popular in the last couple of years, and I think that isn't strictly because of internal communications, it's also just teams willing to share and, move away from email, which was so popular. I think there was a group on the platform and Viva Engage that had been sharing a common email for over a decade. You know, they had this email that they sent around, and they finally switched over to Viva Engage. And of course, the benefit is now you can include all these other people and bring other participants into the conversation. So I know you're asking about metrics, but I think it's an evolving metric. It's an evolving standard, I should say. So
Yeah.
what we look for, it is based more on what we've seen in the past, and then sometimes what the um, if the tool is proprietary or if the vendor has a good idea of what we should expect, that helps too to say, okay, what does success look like?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny because what you mentioned before is you're sort of doing your own internal benchmarking, which is what I have to kind of break to people a lot of the time. They're
Yeah,
sort of expecting that there's this like silver bullet standard that everybody should be setting. And so there's just so many variables that go into it, as you kind of were alluding to, that it's really tough to do that. So you just have to kind of be able to set a bit of a goal for yourself and then see what it looks like. And then, compare and contrast as you go forward, like what seemed to work, what didn't, right? So.
exactly. And what have you seen, Jesse? I mean, do you see that people relax a little bit when you tell them that and they realize that there is no keys to the kingdom, that they were doing it right all along?
Well, it's more like whether they were doing it right all along or not is typically one of the first things, right? I think a lot of it is just the idea of building the discipline, the practice of measurement in the first place for a lot of organizations isn't always necessarily there. I mean, if you're at a larger organization and enterprise, it's sort of expected. But if we're working with like, small, medium businesses or mid-market companies that are just sort of expanding and growing, it might not be something that they sort of established already. Even like what you were saying before with Viva Engage is kind of curious too, because from a communication standpoint, you might be doing a bit of a triage there, whether you mean to or not, where you're sort of allowing for this sort of side path for maybe less than critical comms or nice to know information or things like that being able to be distributed without necessarily being extra work for the comms team, where it's, the more the critical or the strategic communications, you can kind of have that happening in those more democratic platforms instead, right? So.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess one of the other things that I wanted to ask as we get out of the unmuted moments is like maybe if there's a particular lesson you might have learned the hard way about communicating at work that maybe you'd be able to speak to.
I have a good story about that actually. I was supporting an HR leader who had been recently appointed from the consulting area into the HR department. And so she was really used to working at a fast pace and getting things done immediately. And she moved into a department that had been relatively stable without a lot of change for 7 or 10 years. So people had kind of gotten used to doing things a certain way. And their aspirations or their goal setting was what she would call table stakes. So she was not impressed typically by a lot of what she was hearing, and she was concerned because there was genuine need to transform the HR organization and make it support the business in ways that were more modern, more of what the business needed. And what I liked that she did is she took this analogy of an orchestra. So everybody has a different role, they play a different instrument, but if we're not in harmony, we're just making a lot of noise.
Yeah.
And no one wants to sit and listen to that, right? And we took that analogy and we carried it through the year. And it was a tough year for some people. I'm not going to lie. It was a lot of change, a lot of team transformation. Some people left the organization. But I think that analogy was so positive and powerful for people because once you put it in front of them, it's apparent and it's obvious. Of course, I wanna be part of the orchestra and play in harmony. I don't want to be the random drummer that's going off to their own marching to their own their own, pace, and I think she was really good at articulating that and bringing it back to that analogy throughout the year, and so that transformation ended up being something that genuinely improved the operational side of the business, and I think I learned a lot from that because that was one of my first major HR transformations that I supported. And I took a note from that book, or I took a page from that book, I should say, and I tried to take that with me in the future so that I was always thinking about give something to people that they can aspire to, give them something to work towards, um, play to people's ambition versus their fears.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I mean, nothing like a well-placed metaphor, right? I mean, I do it all the time from an implementation standpoint of like, let's talk about it from a garden standpoint, like
Nice.
grapple with
That's
that.
a good one. Yeah.
Mhm.
I like the garden one personally. That's highly relatable.
Sure. Yeah. Right. On. So maybe we'll shift a little bit about towards like the work behind the work. And so thinking about, what when people think about your role, what's the biggest thing they misunderstand? I'd be curious to kind of hear about that from more like the enterprise level from your standpoint.
Sure. Yeah, it's surprisingly common,
Mhm.
across the organizations I've worked with. The first request is, "I want an email to go out." I want an email to go out to a company, and I usually have to get them to step back and say, "Well, what problem are you trying to solve?" Because in reality, what we do, it's a combination of governance, psychology, stakeholder alignment, and then translations between people who move at radically different speeds. So it's really great when I have built up enough rapport and influence with my stakeholders that they're going to call me in earlier in the process and say, "We have something we need to achieve. There's a problem we need to solve. What does that look like when it comes to the communications?" Because so often it doesn't mean one email that goes out to all the employees. It can mean having strategic champions in different parts of the business who know how to communicate on Viva Engage in their respective groups. And people are going to listen to them far more than an email from one executive. And I think overall, the cultural translation, it's not so much just about language, but it's also about the context, the symbolism. So I mentioned the orchestra. What's the history, right? If someone's been with that company for 20 years or more, what history have they experienced when it comes to change, when it comes to um, new incentives and new ways of doing things? And then how will it resonate? So I think that is really clear to it's fun I should say it's fundamental to communicate that. And so the earlier you can build rapport and influence with leaders and stakeholders in your organization, the more effective you can be as a communications professional.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, going back to our metaphor, you are the conductor in some ways, working with these different stakeholders or the chanty
Yeah.
in the way that I normally describe them. Do you find that you're doing that more and more now with like a Viva Engage tool platform to sort of see if you can get, sort of that influencer aspect going as part of your communications plans? Are you sort of building towards that, or is it more just organically at this point?
The great thing about it is becoming more organic. I
Mhm.
think a year ago or 2 years ago, we were seeing more deliberate need to go to leaders and say, "Can you please remember to post this on Viva Engage?" So that, whether it's a new learning or a webinar series, but now they've gotten into a rhythm and they've gotten their own incentive from it because they see how much influence they have as somebody who posts information that other people find useful. And similarly on Teams, we have some really engaged Teams groups when it comes to our AI tools, and
Sure.
they're getting constant updates that are usually quite interesting and technically relevant. So I'm looking at those on a daily or weekly basis and seeing, well, what can I learn? What's happening? So it is organic after a certain point, but sometimes that initial move needs a little bit of a push and you need to sell it a little bit to the initial champions.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be early adopters, people who are excited to try something new, and sometimes their energy can be almost contagious and get other people to get excited as well.
Mhm. Yeah, you kind of brought up some other piece there with the AI group in teams, which I keep thinking about, which is this idea of like communities of practice as part of like knowledge management, and how do you kind of get that tacit stuff, or how do you bring people up who maybe don't know much about those topics but are interested, and that kind of thing. But I keep thinking about the idea of almost like, could we leverage as internal communicators doing strategic work, like leverage these more organic places to be able to kind of get those important messages out just because you got that foot traffic or because you got that engagement, right? And I think there's like it's a give and take, and you can't necessarily take advantage of these things, but at the same time, it's sort of like it's seemingly the way that the communication is flowing in these larger orgs, and meaning to sort of be adaptable and shift and that kind of stuff, right? So,
Absolutely. And you probably see in your own experience, Jesse, that just having a good relationship with the most active people who are
mm,
using the tool makes them feel accountable and vice versa to the people providing the information or the updates. So if I'm working with those champions, let's say for learning or and just a specific module that we're trying to promote, that can be really helpful that they're coming to me and saying, well, how might I say this? Or what would be the most important things we can share? Or do we have the right links to the FAQs? Is that going to the right place on the intranet?
yeah,
So those are the things that build trust and then they build confidence by iterative processes and just seeing that over time that what they're sharing gets listened to and people are genuinely engaging with it. But it still comes down to relationships and definitely you wouldn't want to forego some of the more formal traditional comms like the email in some cases, but the email might simply be the cherry on top versus
yeah,
the spray and pray approach where you just hope that everyone reads the email and does what they're told.
yeah, yeah. Well, do you find that you're still needing to sort of operate with a single source of truth methodology, like as you distribute this kind of stuff, or are you okay with the idea of sort of creating different threads? And kind of curious in that sense.
Well, CGI is very interesting because we have a decentralized model. And
Mhm.
what I really like about that is every strategic business unit that operates in a region of the world has a lot of authority to act independently. So even though I'm on the global communications team and I'm providing what we might call, or we do call communications packs or comms packs that have standard messaging and materials, we are giving these packages to our colleagues in the different regions
Yep.
to personalize. So we're not telling them this must go out as an email. In some cases, what we give them will go out as a Teams message. It might go out as part of a newsletter. It might go out as a Viva Engage group chat. It really depends on the context. But what I love about that is it's context appropriate for that region. So, for
Totally.
example, in some regions, they prefer a more formal newsletter approach from the senior leader, and that leader has a regular communication, a regular newsletter that goes out. And so people are expecting to get that and they're waiting for that. And they read it because they know that whatever's in it is going to be important because their team members talk about it or their colleagues talk about it, I should say. And so that would be very different from a region where the senior leader may almost never communicate across that entire region, but they're going to be more targeted and strategic. And so teams, groups, or smaller targeted messages would make more sense in that particular region. And this would come down to things like language. So we might have, for example, regions that include 4 or 5 different languages. And so when the leader communicates, they might use, let's say, English plus another language, but they could have multiple messages that go out in the different languages, and each one by a slightly more focused or sub-regional leader. And so again, it allows for a more flexible approach according to the needs of that region and the market there.
Sure. Yeah. So, as far as like key messaging context, you'll have that sort of adaptive, which is great. I'm a big fan of that too. Uh,
Yeah.
but I'm curious, like, you're probably managing like the process documentation or policy documentation in more of like a single source, pointing to the actual content somewhere rather than having it captured in the post. Does that sound fair?
Yeah, we try to do that. So, especially for things like security or ethics or HR documentation, we're considering that our colleagues in those respective areas are the subject matter experts and they're going to keep that repository up to date. So,
Yeah.
whether it's an FAQ or the latest policy on whatever it may be, security, ethics, or an HR policy, they are responsible for that and making sure that that documentation is updated, and then in our case, we might be updating links within the communication, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's great. Before we kind of leave this part of the conversation and shift maybe more towards tech, I was kind of curious if there was. You may have already answered this, but I was thinking about asking you like, what's the hardest thing about internal comms no one's talking about? You mentioned a few times now in sort of the relationship side of things. Would you sort of frame it in the same way, or is there maybe something else we haven't talked about yet?
Oh, absolutely. I would say it can be emotionally exhausting to be the person who's absorbing misalignment before translating it. So maintaining psychological stability across functions, being the calm source of knowledge and logic, trying to bring calm to chaos, right? So people come to us hoping that we're going to make sense of things, and we're getting questions at every level from executives who want that answer yesterday to new employees who might not know how to navigate their way around the organization yet. And they're equally frustrated, equally lost um, in some cases. And so trying to bridge those realities and help people orient themselves and feel confident as they move forward in whatever it is they need to do is fundamental. But at the same time, as a communications leader, you can't necessarily show all of that frustration or that uncertainty. You have to be calm and
Yeah.
you have to learn how to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty at a whole new level. And I think that's one thing most people who don't work in communications might be surprised by. They wouldn't realize how sort of that image of the duck swimming on the surface of the water and just like frantically paddling below the surface, but above the water, everything is relatively stable and steady. And similar like the story about the consulting leader who moved to HR, that team was so used to these very steady rhythms and pace of everything. And she wanted to see things change immediately. And so my role became bridging those two worlds and helping people feel like they could make those changes. Obviously, I wasn't alone in doing this because I was communicating along with many other people on the team, but it became kind of a case of modeling behavior. How do you show what's possible to people who feel like you're asking me to fly when all I've ever done is swim?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it reminds me of a story of when I was working in comms, and my boss was like, "We all have to be Spock, like we all have to be that
that's a great one.
you know, the,
Yes.
the calm person who's just the voice of truth and intelligence from everybody." But at the same time, it's like we all know what's going on behind the scenes at times. And it's funny because if you're successful at doing what you should be doing, you're sort of making it look easy almost to just have that kind of calmness or that sort of collectedness, right? So yeah,
Yeah. And that goes back to the challenge of getting the request that says, I need you to send an email
mhm,
because that's what they remember you doing in the
right,
past.
yeah,
And you have to go back and educate them and say, so what problem are we trying to solve here? Let's talk through this problem. Let's figure out, is the email what we need or do we need another approach? And that can be like, again, if you're doing it right, it seems intuitive and people think, oh, this is just what she does. This is just what we do, and it's sometimes difficult to make that value visible or show people that you're bringing order to chaos beyond the deliverable of the email or the messaging. And that's okay. I mean, we don't all sign up for this because we want the glory and the attention. I get it, although it's nice to have that too.
sure.
But yeah, it's really validating to speak with other people in communications because you instantly get it. You see it, you've lived it, you know it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I have to explain to people sometimes when we're waiting for a comms person to show up. I'm like, they're probably putting out a fire. It's okay if they need a minute or two, right? So
Exactly. Yeah.
well, let's maybe shift over a little bit towards the tech side. We kind of talked a bit about it already, thinking about AI and sort of the different tools and that kind of thing. I wanted to maybe start off with the AI question around like how it's actually impacting internal comms and knowledge sharing. So I wanted to get your take. Like, are we being realistic with like the tools and the expectations, or are we a bit delusional? Like, how are you seeing it from your side?
I think I'm a little bit surprised by the number of times I'm hearing people say, "Oh, but you can't trust what it says, it hallucinates." And I'm thinking, "Yeah, exactly. So, but why wouldn't you assume that?" And I guess it's because I started using the tool as soon as, November of 2022, I think, when ChatGPT
Yeah,
was widely released. Um, I just wanted to play around with it and have some fun and quickly learned, of course, you can't just cut and paste, and to do that is folly and you will quickly regret it. So, yes, AI gives me a great way to spar, to play, test ideas, explore creativity, but always, 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 I need to evaluate and interpret and adapt. And so at this point, it's a fabulous tool for starting from scratch. How often do we still have to look at a blank screen these days? It's not so fraught where you're staring at the blank screen and feeling like you could come up with something.
Totally. Yeah.
But I think where people may need some help is to understand that their judgment, their discernment, their ability to adapt things is still fundamental to the quality of the work that ultimately goes out, or the messaging. And I don't really see at an end to the day where the real differentiator will be the human in the loop. So your tone, your judgment, your empathy, and even likability, because people will respect somebody that they can trust. And so often, I mean, I've given prompts and still been dismayed to see that the output is so literal in terms of what I've asked for. It doesn't get the nuance, it doesn't get the subtleties that I need.
Yeah.
So I would say when it comes to technology, there's still a role for humans, but you need to understand your strengths as the human in the loop. Like,
Mhm.
what are your strengths? Can you say what those are? Can you define those? Because I think we've lived through so many decades of people hyperscaling their technical abilities and being able to sell those. I know this tool and that tool and I can adapt, and that's great. No, it's not a bad thing to know the tools, but if you can't differentiate what makes you distinctive and you're simply using the tools, I think it's harder to position your value to prospective clients or employers to say, yes, I know how to use all these great tools, but I also have these other qualities that you can't just copy and paste. And that's going to make you unique in many senses, or at least in higher demand. It's not so easy to replicate.
Hmm. Yeah, and it kind of exists at the individual level or even at the cultural level because you kind of described it there before. Like, I'm trying to get you to do something, but it's too literal. It's not actually taking into account like who we are as an organization or who I am as a writer. So it kind of gets to the topic of like the cultural side of things. And I was wondering like if you see it as a case that maybe we're not there yet, or maybe we're like working towards it, or like from a sense of can the tools potentially be like a cultural support or some sort of like cultural element, or is it more like a what we're not there yet, or we need to, I haven't used the right prompt or something like that, right? Like
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
I think tools can support culture, but they can't create the behaviors that build trust. So it's really great when you have a tool that people do trust. And I'd be curious to know your experience when you see the difference between a client you're working with who experiences consistency and reliability, and all of a sudden they're willing to try all these new things because the tool has given them that. But that also needs to be matched by the humans in the organization. So if you introduce a new tool and it's a great tool, that's the first step. And I think here maybe Viva Engage and what I was saying earlier is a good analogy or a good example. Because if nobody's using it, and if it's not being taken up and really leveraged by people of influence. It doesn't necessarily have to be senior leaders, but people who have opinions and relationships that other people in the organization care about. That tool tends to lie dormant, or it just doesn't get the full utilization that it might. And
Yeah.
so that's where having those human ambassadors or champions can make all the difference. And so I would say ultimately, AI can support cultural translation and show patterns, but it can't replace a good leader who knows what really works with a group of people. And so understanding the culture and what resonates is so important.
Mhm.
And I think the other thing is, AI can help fill knowledge gaps, but it might not sense emotional risk. So every organization, every culture skews in one way or another just based on who it attracts and who it retains. And AI can kind of find that pattern and it can start to point things out, but it is never as fast, in my experience anyway, yet as saying, someone who really knows the culture and says, "Oh, we would never use that line." Like, I can't believe you would use that sentence. Like that's just going to inflame people, and they're going to complain and they're going to get upset.
Yeah.
And AI might say, "Oh, but this is very neutral and diplomatic," and what's wrong with it? So yeah, there's a lot of really interesting um, nuances that I'm seeing with how large language models treat language and certain words that come up frequently, even with the latest release of ChatGPT 5.1.
Mhm.
I'm not sure when this episode will come out, but I mean, it was like a couple weeks ago or last week. And I'm already seeing, oh, yay, it finally doesn't put M dashes in every other sentence.
Yeah.
Wonderful. But now I'm noticing that it loves to use the word quietly and all the time, like I'm having to make new rules. So yeah, after a while, even if AI doesn't spot the patterns, humans will, and they'll say, "Why are you using this word so much? And where's that coming from?"
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, like from my point of view, there's a couple aspects to culture, obviously, that we would want to consider. So there's sort of like there's the sort of tone and the way of speaking and sort of the presentation of it. But then there's also sort of the behavioral aspect of it. So I find like I'd say the AI is better suited towards the behavioral side of things right now. As far as like building flows or reinforcing flows and things like that, that would sort of build that cultural aspect within the organization. But it's still like relatively new. But it's curious, like you mentioned that you're sort of like an early adopter. I was sort of in the same boat where as soon as new tools arrive, I'm just curious. I always want to check it out. And I do find that funny. Like most communicators that I speak with are all very much like, I want to learn something. I want to find something new, right? But I'm curious to see how many of us in the internal comms profession are sort of taking it to the next step and thinking about like the actual flow side of things. So like, building agent tools within the way that they're sort of doing their work today. I haven't heard much of that yet, but I'm kind of curious, like when that starts to kick in, what does that look like? And so I'm kind of wondering, like, I don't have to put you on the spot, but like I'm just sort of curious if you've been thinking about that or if you've done any of that kind of stuff.
Definitely, I want to experiment more with tools that can help me create more organized documentation, so that I'm always going back to stable documentation or stable information that isn't just context dependent on the latest chat or the latest week of interactions that I've had with the tool.
Yeah.
I don't have as much experience with that. At this point, I am using different tools for different tasks, and I sometimes use them to test each other. So, for example, if I've come up with something on ChatGPT, then maybe I want to test it on Claude,
Yeah.
um, create a prompt with one of those tools, and then use it in Gemini Pro Flash to get the ultimate photo that I want. So
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
it's a lot of slice and dice, which is fun because I'm not as methodical when it comes to technology, but I think if I could get to a more methodical place, I'd probably have more stable outputs, and I think we will get there. Um, I do wanna see more people just get to the comfort level of where we are though, Jesse. Like, I'd like to see
Yeah.
more people feel like my first instinct when I wanna come up with ideas is, like, help ChatGPT give me a starting running start, and then I'm gonna build on that with my knowledge. So but I'm still seeing a lot of people, like I mentioned earlier, saying, "Oh, but it gives me hallucination or it gives me wrong information," and say, "Yeah, because that's just a starting point. That's not what you take as your final product."
Mm.
Um but I am eager to see where we can go, and I know the whole conversation around vibe coding is very exciting because suddenly you have people who wouldn't have had
Yeah.
deep technical experience being able to create things, products that, just weren't possible before.
Mm.
And so it will challenge the status quo. We're gonna see products that are designed by people who would never have otherwise been able to design those products because they just didn't have the history, the knowledge, but then how will that challenge the really technical people to see the product differently and say, "Oh, well, if I was, a website designer who didn't know how to code,
Mhm.
what have they need that I've never been able to anticipate?" And I just so I think this whole idea, or rather being an ideas person is a really exciting space to occupy right now because finally we have tools to reach an iteration at least or one version of what we dreamed of that we just couldn't reach before because we were limited by some of our abilities or our skills.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is pretty exciting in that regard for people like us. I think the other part that you mentioned earlier, I can't recall if it was like in this conversation or before when we started recording, but you were mentioning about how there's a sort of added challenge of maintaining the documentation that comes out of all of these AI threads and things like that, so that you kind of are able to go back to it. There's also the other angle of the vibe coding, which I like to joke about. I call vibe maintenance, which folks really thinking about that. So it's like, I'm going to pass this code program to somebody who has no idea how I built it or how I got there, right? But so I'm wondering, like, from a knowledge standpoint, if you've been thinking about the AI side of things, I'm always interested in that, and like whether you think AI should or shouldn't be used to help people find that knowledge faster, or do you think that it's still a case like we need to maybe have more sort of guardrails or have that human in the loop, to sort of keep an eye on things, keep it honest, trustworthy, that kind of thing?
That's a good question. I think intuitively I'd say yes, I would like to see AI facilitate easier knowledge sharing. Um, but is it totally independent? How much human accountability do we have? That would take testing, and that usually means you have to give it to people in the real world and see how it runs, and what kind of wacky, unusual results do you get when somebody types in the wrong or the weird query or that whatever it may be. What do you think though? Like, where have you seen things go wrong, or conversely, where have you seen things work that you thought, oh, that's great. I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, I still think that there's absolutely a need for subject matter experts in the world we're in right now. It's kind of like those are the footings or the like the pillars of the organization in a lot of ways. So being able to have that person part of that system, I think is still absolutely critical right now. Whether that changes in the future or not, I don't know. Like that's kind of an interesting piece for me if you look at it in a long enough time frame to see if like we could have a collective understanding of particular subject matter expert across a variety of different industries at different scales in different parts of the world, and all of that starts to coalesce at some point. But we're not there yet. So I would argue that it definitely needs to be the point where we have that person there, part of that. So yeah.
Definitely. And I'm concerned when I hear stories about obviously anachronistic results that come up with just searches for well-known established historic information,
Mm.
or even people that are using AI to cheat on a test. I mean, not that we would advocate that ever, but
Mhm.
it's kind of ironic that you hear stories about people using it and then failing the test because AI gave them the wrong information. So then I have to wonder, well, where is that information coming from? And I'm not sure about the information hygiene, if it's how much of the tool is just taking in mass produced erroneous information, and how much is there, how much of the information is actually going through a gatekeeper, ideally several gatekeepers who are human subject matter experts.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like we're anywhere near being able to just trust AI to build knowledge and update it and make it consistent. It's too hallucinatory, it's too confident, and that's part of the problem. Is it always has this tone of confidence that it's very persuasive for
Mhm.
people who are just in a pinch and they're looking for something quick and they think, well, that seems about right. I think that sounds right. And then you really do have to double check, triple check, validate. Is it correct? Because if it isn't, you're contributing to that overall um, spreading of misinformation, and that's not a good feeling for me anyway. I really don't want to contribute to that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's becoming more and more interesting to see where, internal communications professionals are starting to sort of have to work with these disciplines or think about knowledge in a more sort of strategic way than maybe we had in the past. I'm curious from your perspective, like where do you see the line between communications and knowledge sharing? Are those still very distinct for you in the role that you're doing today? Is it starting to maybe blur a little bit more compared to what it was like 6 months, a year ago, that kind of thing?
I think they're blending. I would say that knowledge will always shape what communication should focus on, but what we decide is knowledge worth sharing, um, that is open to all kinds of different levels of interpretation. So I think they should be working very much closely hand in hand. And also communication is what can make knowledge relevant. So good storytelling. Even when I'm thinking about use cases like what makes a compelling learning module? Well, it's when you have real life scenarios that people relate to and they think, oh, that could have happened to me, or I'm going to need to watch out for this particular scenario. And that's a really nice way of making the knowledge stick and making it relevant for people.
Yeah.
And the communication needs to be woven in through that. So I think they need to work more and more closely together. And I see it as a fundamental relationship that it's important to understand and appreciate.
Yeah. No, I really like that idea about the storytelling. It applies in a variety of different ways, whether you're distributing the knowledge or even potentially trying to capture the knowledge. I think people love to tell a story, but it's sort of like they don't necessarily realize that what they're telling you is some knowledge, right? That is sort of within that, or it's the seed of the actual story itself. So,
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example.
yeah. I guess like from your team's perspective, you mentioned before to me that you have like a bit of a larger team overseeing different aspects of the organization. Is like this idea of knowledge capture part of what you guys do? Is it sort of another team within the organization that maybe oversees that? Is it still something that's relatively growing at the organization? I'm just kind of curious if you can maybe speak to that because I'm really interested in seeing how people are adapting. Again, like with AI being sort of like a car that needs to have this fuel of knowledge, like how are we adapting as organizations now, right?
Definitely. I'm still seeing a lot of organic exchange. So,
Mhm.
where I see the most compelling uptake of shared practices or fresh ideas is in our biweekly calls where we have regional communications leaders sharing a recent campaign or idea that they've applied, whether it's profiling new employee or talent stories, or we have regular calls about how to use our brand assets and people learn about that and then they get their own ideas, but it's still standardized.
Mhm.
But again, it's not necessarily just, a platform or a repository. It's people explaining how they used the materials that we have access to create new products, new materials, new um, access points even. So
Mhm.
I would say that exchange and communication between individuals, so just regular old human communication like this
Yeah.
is as fundamental and as important as ever. And
Mhm.
maybe that's where my caution around AI is has been raised a little bit lately because I'm hearing about a lot of people using the tool almost exclusively to exchange ideas and not necessarily sharing that with other people in their lives and maybe going down a really deep exploration, but they're not getting the benefit of sparring with another human being to question or explore those ideas.
Mhm.
So I think organizing human exchange and Viva Engage is a virtual form of that or Teams. And those are just two tools, I guess. I don't want to keep naming tools, but I'm just thinking
Yeah,
what
yeah.
comes to mind.
Right.
Um, those can make it possible for me to learn from my colleagues who might be in a totally different time zone that, I might never get a chance to speak to them directly or very rarely for like a short part of the day.
Totally. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's an old-fashioned answer, but still it's old-fashioned communication that still,
Yeah.
keeps people engaged.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, like, it's much more engaging for me to have a voice conversation with you. I think the shift for me that I'm thinking of is like there's a behavioral piece that's sort of missing. It's like I need an automated flow almost of like, okay, and we're starting to see that now. Where I have a conversation with you, I'm doing a transcript right now as I'm recording the call, right? So how does that transcript get translated into learnings that can then be passed on or accessed by other people who are doing different things or needing insights or whatever that looks like in the future. So it's a curious thing, and that we're all going through the sort of the shift. Whether we sort of focus on that or not is maybe another aspect to it. But I do think that it becomes more and more important because we're getting so much information. I could have a conversation all day with everybody all the time. I'm still only going to retain so much of it, right? So being able to tap back into that in a more sort of programmatic way or a more sort of stable way in the future is probably going to be important. And, I'll need those things going forward. Yeah, we keep talking about like the large language model stuff being too much of a hallucination and all that. And I keep thinking about it like it's going to be a large language model that needs to almost like narrow itself down as it goes into an organization and has to consider things like culture, has to consider all these conversations happening internally, right? So,
Yeah. Well, that's been really interesting because I do use an enterprise version of ChatGPT as well. And so seeing what it pulls up relevant to my organization and some of the norms has been
yeah.
really interesting. And that's, of course, quite useful.
Mhm.
And so that's a great example of narrowing. So how do we make these tools useful for more specific organizational contexts? And at the same time, I mean, I wouldn't use that tool necessarily to come up with personal brainstorm lists or things like that, but it can really help me quickly narrow my focus in a document of what I'm trying to create. So, yeah, I think there's definitely going to be more and more opportunity to narrow or even just create more logical hierarchies of understanding. So, if I'm looking for a search word in my intranet, I would love to see a day where that becomes a little more intuitive based on the search function being designed in a little more, thoughtful way just based
Yeah.
on analysis, and I think we'll get there. I don't think it's that far away, but it's sort of one of those stereotypes where some people complain and they say, "Well, I use this search term and it's not coming up." Well, we're getting there, um, but at the end of the day, these tools they're built, for huge organizations that have so many functions and requirements and demands. And we all want to feel like, our request is the normal, natural one that everyone can anticipate, but that's simply not the case.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because there's a narrowing of the AI tool itself, but then there's also the consideration for like I'm seeing too much stuff, generally speaking,
Yeah.
probably most of the challenge that people are facing. So contextualizing that or making it so that the end user is getting their own kind of narrow view of what they need to know. I think that's going to be a bit challenging for these tools. And we'll probably have to wait maybe a week or two for the next version, right? So we'll see. But yeah. You did actually bring up something though that I wanted to ask you about, which was intranet search. You said it. So I was going to go back to that. And I always want to know from like larger organizations, how are you able to sort of encourage people to search before they ask to like nowadays? It's an important piece from like an efficiency. You want to obviously get the use out of these tools that you're investing in. And so I'm kind of wondering if you've done anything or you've maybe supported with anything like that at your.
Great question because that comes up in every organization. And what I've seen where it works best is people just modeling the behavior privately. So searching first and then asking concise, well formed questions that indicate, yes, indeed, I did do this search and I looked at these pages and I still don't have what I need. So, making that normal, and so normalizing that means that you're showing that, you're communicating that, and if somebody asks you, "Where's the template for X?" "Oh, it's on Google Docs," or it's on Teams, but you've got to search for it. So, not always giving the full answer, but indicating that you can search for it. I think that's been a cultural norm that I've seen now in 3 different organizations.
Mhm.
That means people are signaling, "Oh, it's just normal to search for these things and you can find them, try again and you'll
Right.
get there."
Yeah.
Um, but it is interesting when you see a new team member come on board, how normal that is. So they might have come from an organization that they didn't trust the search results. So they're going to go to somebody and say, "Well, just tell me where to find it," and it's like, "No, you really can trust Google Docs here. It's going to come up for you. Trust me." Um, so it's funny to see that behavior kind of take hold after somebody's gotten introduced to the new culture and they start to get comfortable.
Yeah, trust is not something to be taken for granted.
Oh,
It's a very precious thing that you don't even notice it if things are going right, you know?
exactly. And I've been fortunate to work in some pretty great places where I've seen what success does look like when it comes to search function and just knowledge management being kept up to date and a lot of thoughtfulness put in. Um, And so maybe, it's been a while since I've worked for a smaller company, so I can't speak to recent experience of, the sort of the stereotypes of what goes wrong, but I do deeply appreciate being in a place where things are run well, even if you never find out just how well, because they're never allowed to fail to the point where it's catastrophic.
Right.
It's much appreciated, I can say.
Mhm. You mentioned before, like the onboarding and all that kind of piece. Like leaders obviously play a part in all of this. I'm just kind of curious if you maybe want to speak a bit to sort of like how leaders can shape the culture of knowledge sharing, or what all of that looks like from like a more operational sense, I guess.
Definitely. It's interesting when you work with a leader who is less comfortable with using certain tools, and they will kind of make it sort of your job to learn the tools, and I don't want to have anything to do with that. I mean, it also depends on age and seniority. If somebody's near retirement and they don't want to work on a PowerPoint, I'm not going to argue with that. Especially if they're one of the more senior leaders in the company, they've more important things to do.
Sure.
Um, and I look forward to a day where most tools become a little more intuitive, hopefully,
Mhm.
so that people who are uh, maybe not on the cutting edge of things, they still can adapt without a lot of pain and suffering. Um, but I think again, it's about modeling ultimately with the leadership. If they're showing the behaviors they want to see, that is so much more powerful than just, you know, do what I say, not what I do. I don't see a ton of that, but it's sort of the stereotype of, somebody who's just not doing what they expect everyone else to do. And that just it's no fun, and people quickly see through that. So,
Mhm.
it's important to learn skills and learn the norms and model those so that you can be confident in your role.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned kind of like that senior leader who's maybe on the verge of retirement or things like that. I still look at that as a prime opportunity almost for this whole concept of knowledge sharing and knowledge capture. Because that person likely has so much experience and all this information that they could benefit the org with. And it's almost like, how can you get them to tell all those stories almost and then figure out a way to turn that into something a little bit more, actionable, or create these little pillars of knowledge within the organization with those. So I don't know. There's maybe something there, but I'm
Yeah.
always thinking about that because they have so much available within them that you potentially lose as they leave the org. So
That's a great point, and I'm concerned as well if we're not hiring as many interns in these large companies. I'm not speaking personally here, but hearing about stories where large companies, large banks or brokerages are saying, well, you don't really want to hire an intern. They make mistakes. Let's just use an AI solution. Well, what's going to happen to the generation that needs to take in all the new knowledge? And, you're not really transferring that knowledge because now you're using the AI. So
mhm.
are we expecting a younger generation to simply, hit the ground running, so to speak, because they're going to come into organizations being expected to adapt much more quickly and adhere much more comprehensively to complexity and knowledge that otherwise they would have taken in as interns. But that's still a problem we haven't resolved. I mean, that's not going away. So it's something I think about as well.
Yeah.
But how do we capture the wisdom, the insights of the senior members of the organization? That's deeply important. It would be such a shame to lose that.
Yeah. You kind of just answered a question that I was going to ask you next, which was, what's a popular comms or HRIT trend that you think is mostly hot air? I don't know if you meant to answer it that way, but when you're speaking about this whole concept around the interns, that's sort of what it made me think of. But I was curious, like, do you have another take on that, or is there another answer if I were to ask you it more formally?
Yeah, I think that just looking to make tools the be all and end all or place all the blame on the tools is a bit of a so it removes accountability. It's nice to say, well, I'm going to use this tool for everything and it's going to be the one and only solution. But then when things go wrong and you want to blame that tool, where does that leave you? You have to make it integrate with the culture. And that means understanding the tool as part of that human in the loop philosophy. So, where I get worried, I think sometimes when people get a little too all or nothing about tools versus people. And
Mhm.
I like to see the value in both. And I
Yeah.
don't think I don't want to be a doomsayer and say, oh, it's all, AI is taking all of our jobs. But at the same time, yes, you do need to learn these tools, and
Mhm.
uh, it's in your, you should be incentivized because you have the benefit of better tools to use once you learn them.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I yeah, I would say that there's sort of like a need when you're building. It's almost like we need to redesign the systems and the processes that we have at the org.
Yeah.
Still centralized around people, but it's just to say like, how do these people interact with these tools and in concert? Again, going back to our initial metaphor, it's like, how is all of this being conducted now properly? I think that's the part that's kind of missing right now, where you have the AI is the drummer going off on its own direction in some respects, and you need to kind of
Yeah.
put that back in and have it all more optimized, I guess, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and the other one I wanted to ask around sort of this hot take piece is like, if you could unlearn one best practice in your field, what would it be?
I think many of us were trained to think the safest, most professional move is to strip color out of our thinking, smooth the edges, package everything into nice, tidy, efficient little outputs. But here's the thing, if you water your message down far enough, it turns into vanilla soft serve, which is great for a 30-second summer cone, but it's absolutely terrible for leadership because it melts the second you need it to hold its shape. So um, you need some color, you need some individuality. Those edges might be a little rough, but sometimes they make things real for people. So I think that's the risk we run. And I see that again with a lot of contemporary AI outputs, this real trend towards abstraction. I can't tell you how many times I say, use concrete language, be specific. Don't use so many of these abstract terms. And I get it. We want to sound like we're philosophical or that we're thinking strategically, but it's not effective if we can't come back down to earth and think
Mhm.
about, well, what does this really mean? What does it look like, feel like, smell like, taste like? And hopefully it's not. I'm not that there's anything wrong with vanilla soft serve, but it has its place. It's not for the long run. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. It's making me think of a lot of different things what you just said. So it's like I'm having flashbacks. So, but no, went through this initial phase at one of the organizations I was at, where the communications just weren't being read, and so what we had to do is think of what do we do, and we kind of just built that edge into it. So we had like internal monologues of this like fake person sort of reacting to what was being said, or we put funny titles into it, or things like that, because you just need to get people to pay attention almost to a certain.
Exactly. Just get them to stop the infinite scroll and say, "Oh, that's odd."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then, "Oh, okay, why is this? Why?" Okay, and then they kind of pause in their automated approach.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that there's something to be said too, but what you were mentioning about being more concrete, in the sense that there's sort of like the company communications, but then there's also like the operational communication side of things. And you need to kind of respect both of those sides. These people who are reading your operational communications, they only got like 30 seconds or whatever, right, between what they were doing and what they're going to be doing next. And so you want to obviously translate that as quickly as you can. So I'd back that up for sure. I think you're definitely on point there. So.
Right?
The other one I wanted to ask was, what's something you wish more execs understood about the employee experience? So coming at it more from, you're sort of being more empathetic and siding with the audience. What are they missing, or what do they need to know?
That people respond to communication emotionally first, always.
Yeah.
And people also don't admit that because most people don't want to understand that they do that, or they can't, or they deny that. It's just we are fundamentally emotional creatures, and many of us rationalize things almost immediately after we have an emotional reaction.
Mhm.
And so that makes it really tricky because you have to talk to people as though they are rational first, even while you're recognizing that the emotion will always be the most fundamental element to who they are. And I think this is very confusing and contradictory. But once you can accept the contradiction, it becomes a little easier, and you start to see that when messages resonate, people are calm and grounded and they feel supported. But then the other side to that, or maybe an addendum to that, is great messages need to be repeated over and over and over to take hold. So you as an executive may have been in the room 10 times and said that, but maybe you said that to 10 different audiences in 10 different cities. And so for you, it's like, oh, well, obviously everyone knows this. And yet, those audiences, if they heard it, they were also thinking about what they're going to have for lunch or the project that's due at the end of the day. But hey, they have to listen to this presentation. How are they going to make time to get that project done? And what was the executive saying? Oh, I missed that. So there's a lot of conflict, like you were saying. We have so much information coming at us, and so that instinct to repeat can be a little bit, sometimes we might hesitate and say, "Oh gosh, we've been communicating so much, we shouldn't do that." But
Mhm.
yet we know just from human behavior and evidence that people do need to hear those things over and over. And then the next step or the next piece is that foundational ideas, that vision, that dream of what you had when you started your company, they constantly must have new life breathed into them to stay relevant. So, what
Yeah.
felt like a resonant, galvanizing story for you 20 years ago is not going to serve the same purpose to a new employee. And so, looking for those echoes, the analogies, the repetition to make those foundational beliefs and vision fresh and relevant to every new generation in your workplace is a creative demand that I think communicators love. I mean, it's challenging, but it's so important to people believing in what is being said.
Yeah. No, there's an interesting piece to that because this idea of the emotional response, I think, can dramatically change the need for repetition as well. Like if I tell you something that really just hits you in the gut, you might remember that after I just barely even told it to you, you know? But if it's something that's a little bit more just straight laced, there doesn't have that kind of emotional capacity to it, then that's more the challenging ones to remember. It just sort of washes over you a little bit. So there's an interesting kind of consideration there. I think the other piece too, we talked about measurement at the beginning, and I'm curious, like, are you measuring for sort of like awareness, right? Because the other side of all of this that I find is it's easy to get caught up with like, well, we had traction, we had sort of like foot traffic going through the stuff that they're supposed to know, but have we like strictly and specifically or explicitly asked, like, do you understand that this is going to happen, right? And like, are we able to validate at that level? I know that that's not something most people do, but I'm just sort of interested, like, if you've thought about that, or you guys consider that as part of your measurements internally or anything like that.
That's been interesting. One of the specific examples I can think of is how do leaders track the business objectives of the organization down to individual professional goals or objectives?
Sure.
So often it feels like, oh, those are big, lofty, abstract ideas. How am I going to possibly put those into my own day to day objectives? But I think what I've seen is an improvement there in terms of the translation of the overall business objectives going down to the department or the team, and then people being able to translate that for themselves into what
Right.
work is that they do.
Mhm.
Maybe it's also just part of becoming more experienced in the workforce and seeing how I contribute to the bigger picture. But I
Right.
think that's been a tangible measurement that I'm seeing referenced more and more,
Mhm.
where people are saying, "Oh, I appreciate how the business objectives are showing up in my team's actual objectives or their individual professional goals." And, that's just one example. I mean, there's so many ways to measure, but I like that one because it makes people feel like they're part of the bigger picture and that they're not just sort of arbitrarily some gear or cog in a wheel, like just randomly doing their own thing. Again, going back to the orchestra analogy, like they have the part to play.
Totally. Yeah. No, I'm always trying to we always end up building, like department pages within the platform as part of implementations. And I keep telling people, like, one of the things I'd love to see is more, org wide goals showing up in the about us content, but then having, department specific goals and objectives that ladder up to the org wide goals in these department pages to sort of show more of the relationship, or like, how are we driving that as a part of our discipline within the org, right? So.
Are you finding that helpful? Are you seeing increased understanding or people being able to find their place based on that?
Yeah, I think, like, depending on the organization, it's a bit of an aha moment for them of like, oh yeah, terrific, like, great. We're trying to really push culture. We're trying to really grow like how we all as an org are working together as one. And what does that look like? And how do we make that more explicit? But in some cases, it's more like a growing pain or like a maturity model kind of consideration where it's like, oh, we never really even thought of that. Like that's going to be some work for us to kind of go back and think like, how do we actually make these sort of things happen within the organization? So it really
Nice.
depends on like size and scale and where they're at in their all development process. So yeah, but it's an interesting consideration. I'm glad to hear though that the sort of like as you get further into more of the enterprise space, that's still like a consideration and a way of measurement, right? So
Yeah, definitely.
to maybe to round out the hot takes side of things, I always like to get the question of, like, I know this is controversial, but like, can you finish that sentence for me? What would you kind of take that towards?
Communication isn't a soft skill alone, it's infrastructure. It's the framework that holds the organization together. It provides cultural coherence and meaning and purpose, and it's happening whether you like it or not. So people are communicating, people are human. Why not do it well? You know?
Yeah,
Um,
that's great.
yeah.
It's funny. I can understand it being controversial. Not controversial to me, but
Yeah.
I appreciate how you're bringing it up that way. Yeah, it's good.
Well, I worked with enough people who kind of treat it like, yeah, yeah, we're gonna send this or do that or say this, but
Right.
really understand how it is core and fundamental to all that you do. And I think if you can appreciate that, even if you're not in communications, you'll find a lot more fits into place or works out for you than if you kind of ignore it to your peril, ignore it at your peril.
Yeah. I think that there's a really big piece around branding and rebranding communications as a term within organizations. And we used operational communications as a way that we kind of did it in my previous life. The other way that I like to think about it is like if we just called it strategic communications, like
Yeah,
really mean a world of difference for us all as far as that initial first conversation you have with somebody, position it like that. So yeah.
nice.
Yeah. Well, we'll maybe shift to kind of the send off side of things here. So we'll just ask a couple few questions before we let you go. But what's one principle or philosophy you try to live by in your work?
What kind of human do you wanna be? We're
Mm,
surrounded by all these awesome tools. We have access to more information than any other human has ever had in the history of the world.
mhm,
I mean, I think we live in a pretty amazing time, but what are the human qualities that you wanna build and grow with? Um, and no matter how technologically advanced you are, it is the human qualities that will probably determine your satisfaction with life and your relationships. So
mhm.
that could transcend work. I think it probably does, but it's something I think about almost every day.
Yeah. I mean, it absolutely is important for a role like ours to really keep that person within yourself and the person that you're talking to, like just that focus on people and where we are within the organization, right? So the organization itself, I suppose, wouldn't exist without the person, right? So if your career had a tagline, what would it be?
Get curious, not furious.
Oh,
I think we have so much stress in our lives. Our professional lives are facing constant change, and whenever I feel like I'm frustrated or I'm not getting something, I try to live by this, which is, can I get curious about this? Can I step back and see this as a puzzle versus a problem? I know that's a bit of a cliche, but when we are fearful, we're just less creative, right? We're just kind of locked down and we're not thinking about possibilities, we're thinking about threats.
mhm,
And so I would say curiosity can be a superpower if you learn to tap into that and use that to stop yourself from contracting and limiting yourself too much.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I kind of look at us as like almost federal marshals to an extent. Like we're allowed to just any room, ask questions, demand answers. But
Yeah.
it- there's sort of that important piece that you mentioned before, which is about the person side of things. And so it's this fine line of being empathetic while also asking bold questions constantly, right? And
Yeah.
having to kind of consider both sides of that. So yeah.
That's a good analogy too. Yeah, it's gotta be about balance
Mhm.
for
Yeah.
sure.
And finally, I wanted to ask if you maybe had any other recommendations on who we might want to talk to next, and maybe why we're thinking that.
I don't have specific individuals, but I'd really like to hear more and learn more from global comms leaders who have navigated transformation and leadership alignment with multiple regions, or looking at how do you make change in a global organization. And again, like looking at that whole idea of the human in the loop theme and empathy, and how do you lead with empathy. And then also, I think looking at real leaders in AI and communications,
Mhm.
I sometimes feel like I am a bit of an early adopter or adapter. Is it early adopter?
I
Early
think both.
adopter. Okay.
Let's put it
We'll
that
say
way.
both. We'll say
Yeah.
both. Um, and I just I'm eager and curious to hear from more communications folks who are trying the tools, or taking their communications application or philosophy to look at through the lens of all these different tools or methodologies. And I'm always interested in that. So I'm sure there's no shortage of people who fit the bill, but I look forward to hearing more of your episodes and all the expertise that you bring to your podcast. I'm sure it's going to be a wealth of information for fellow communications professionals like me. So thank you for what you do there.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're definitely looking to get more individuals with sort of like knowledge management in their role, trying to kind of bridge the gap between the comm side, the consultant side, the knowledge manager side. So I think these are all definitely related roles as we go forward, whether it's like a level of focus or accountability. But they
Mm.
definitely should be sort of working together to help organizations. So
Well, the other thing is, what will our function even be called, or what will our function be called in the next 5 or 10 years? I don't think we're going to keep communications necessarily as our main title. It will be part of it, but it would be really interesting to start hearing from professionals who are doing a lot of what we do, but maybe they have different titles, and they're sharing their story in a different way.
Mhm.
It's one thing I'm always thinking about is what might my professional identity look like in 5 or 10 years? How might I call how might I describe my skills, or will my title be radically different? It might be. Yeah, I'm open to it. I'm
Yeah.
curious to see. Yeah,
Yeah, I think everybody in every role everywhere is thinking that a little bit at this point.
true. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a common experience these days.
yeah. Well, I guess we'll close it there. So that does it for today. Thanks again, Yana, for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse.
If those of you out there found value here, please rate, review, and follow the show. And if you would like to share it with a decision maker who's trying to build teams that communicate with clarity and care, we definitely appreciate that. And they'll thank you for it later as well. So we hope you join us for our next episode of Happeo Unmuted, everybody. Thanks and have a great day.